strength and determination of women, men and children forced to flee their homes and countries to avoid persecution, conflict and violence.
The Desmond Tutu Refugee Reception Center in Marabastad, a safe haven for scores of asylum seekers. Ernest Kiteram and his mother fled Burundi in 1993. They are among the 68.5 million people displaced as of the end of 2017.
We went to school here, we did our matrics here, we went to college here, but we faced problems with the Department of Home Affairs, especially when time to renew, because they said that basically it's free to renew the paper, but when we come here it's not free.
The day recognizes the contributions of refugees in their communities.
A lot of work needs to be done to educate South Africans around asylum seekers, around refugees, and the documents that they carry and the challenges that they face in South Africa, as well as the hardships that they've come and run away from. I think that's very important to educate South Africans on.
But the refugees aren't welcome by everyone.
When you go to Home Affairs, you pay for your ID, you pay for your passport, you don't get it free. So I want to know, because it's a concern to us if they will be coming here and say they want everything free from Home Affairs. We can't do that, and it cannot happen.
When you go inside to do application for passport is a very, very big problem. They don't allow the person to have a passport as a refugee.
The immigration who are arresting people, and they are the one who is giving them a paper. After they come here after 2 months and 3 months, they arrest them and they take them to Central Police Station, and they are asking for releasing money, 10,000, 2,000, 3,000. I want that thing to stop.
Many foreign nationals seeking refuge in South Africa say they daily face challenges such as corruption, harassment and arrests. Offenses Timo, SABC News, Marabastad, Pretoria.
So legally speaking, a refugee in South Africa is defined as a person who has fled their place of habitual residence owing to a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, tribe, religion, nationality, political opinion or membership in a particular social group. This includes people who are forced to flee their countries of origin as a result of external aggression, occupation, foreign domination or events that seriously disrupt public order. An asylum seeker is a person who's seeking recognition as a refugee and whose status has yet to be determined. Now, dependents of such a person also fall under that definition. In order to become a refugee and avail oneself of particular protections, including the right to stay, a person must lodge a claim for asylum with the South African government. But as we are asking in our poll question tonight, is this country welcoming to these people or is it indeed hostile? Kayan Leung is the Detention Monitoring Coordinator at Lawyers for Human Rights, and she joins us this evening. And thank you for talking to us. I mean, as we're asking the poll in our poll question tonight, I mean, is South Africa a safe haven for the people I've just described, or do many of them come here and experience, frankly, a living hell?
Thanks for having me on the show. I would have to say, from our clients' lived experiences, whilst South Africa has a wonderful framework for refugee protection, currently the state and the Department of Home Affairs in particular is falling short on refugee protection and services. How bad is it? Well, Lawyers for Human Rights, and we have collected a number of lived experiences and testimonies from our clients, and it's safe to say that we feel that the asylum system has failed currently, and it's in collapse. Give me some of the worst examples you've encountered. Certainly. Well, some of the examples that we have encountered is, firstly, and I think it was one of the interviewers gave an example of this on the news previously, is that there is systemic corruption happening at every refugee reception office that people are trying to access. That in itself is a huge boundary or challenge for asylum seekers to lodge a claim. But if we drill it down to sort of, the granular details of what people go through, I mean, what are some of the stories, what are some of the horror stories you have heard as a result of these systemic failures? Well, firstly, there are so many. Let me start by saying that a lot of dependents that you have mentioned, children of asylum seekers or refugees, recognized refugees, are failing to get documentation, and as a result, they are constantly being stressed out and harassed at schools because they're
sorry to interrupt you. I mean, I read a story of a couple who lost a child and then couldn't even get access to the remains to bury said child because a birth certificate hadn't been issued, and as a result a death certificate hadn't been issued. I mean, that kind of thing, on top of their grief, they're dealing with this cold, unfeeling system. Absolutely. And I think while we are talking about World Refugee Day and taking cognizance of whether or not South Africa is affording enough protection to asylum seekers and refugees, we fail to recognize first and foremost that these are human beings just like you and I, and basic rights such as, you know, access to education, trying to access health services, documentation that allows you to get a job or to open a bank account. These are challenges that people face on a daily basis. Not to mention the fact that, as you mentioned, I work in the detention monitoring unit. We get a number of calls where people find themselves unable to be documented, and they are subject to scrutiny by immigration officials or police services, and often arrested and suffer severe mental trauma in these places of detention. So is it bureaucratic incompetence? Is it indifference to human suffering that we see these things, or is the system simply overburdened? From what I have seen, UNHCR shared stats for, that were shared with DHA as well, and as the end of 2016, they had, within South Africa, recollected that there were 218,000 asylum seekers and just over 90,000 recognized refugees in South Africa. You've heard what the numbers are globally, and that it's Uganda that's actually receiving most of the refugees from this continent. So we're actually not dealing with a huge floodgate. But to that point, I think it may be, whilst I want to acknowledge that DHA has tried to improve the system, for example, the automated systems, it's not perfectly working currently. And we would not be saying this if we have clients coming into the clinic saying we're not being able to get access. But just to add to that one further point, I think a partial aspect is a lack of political will. For example, the DG recently today on another radio broadcast said, well, actually, most of these asylum seekers are economic migrants. Yes. I would call the DG with respect to actually show us the proof, because they might say, yes, and this is something we have echoed before, 96% of asylum seekers are being rejected. But you have to actually look at that holistically. And when you do, the decisions that Home Affairs is making is actually poorly constructed. There's no legal background to how they came to that decision. And then when we actually do challenge these decisions, most of them are actually overturned. I mean, as a reporter in my former life, I've been to these, asylum centers. For example, I mean, how do people get told that there's no war in Syria, for example? I really can't answer that, because I recollect last year we had a Syrian client who was being threatened with deportation, and we raised this issue and said to him, but there's a war going on in Syria, how can you send this person back to Syria? And their response was, there is no war, it's safe. Despite the fact that we provided numerous international human rights organizations report to contrary this belief. So let's look at a new problem. You've got some children who are born here as they wait for these processes to be finalized, born to parents, obviously, who come with them here, hoping to get refugee or asylum seeker status. What happens to them? Because they become undocumented and they become stateless, in a sense. There is that, you're very correct, there is that potential danger of becoming stateless. So what Home Affairs is supposed to do, and at the moment it requires a lot of intervention from lawyers, and if you're looking at the numbers, not everyone can afford a lawyer, or people have trouble accessing pro bono law clinics. They are supposed to document the child through a birth certificate, and I'd say that process is happening 50-50%, so it's like a roll of the die. But sometimes we're told that the mothers are undocumented, and therefore the children born here can't be documented either. Correct. I mean, what happens in that case then? Where do they belong? Well, they're supposed to be documented. It doesn't matter. The mother should be able to get some form of documentation eventually, and it is a long process. We have worked tirelessly on a number of these cases, because in terms of the Constitution,
every child born in South Africa has a right to have their birth registered. And these barriers that departments are creating really does create that gap and potential for children to become stateless. But further to that, and this is a new policy that we've occurred there, in terms of the regulations, children which are dependents of asylum seekers or refugees should be able to provide certain documentation to be documented under their file and get asylum or refugee permits. That's not the case. They've been told they need to provide DNA tests, which are costly at their own expense.
I'll tell you what, we can talk all we want about days like this, but it's actions, not words, that count. Thank you very much for joining us in the studio. That was, of course, Kayan Leung, a lawyer for human rights. We now go to the weather, and of course we'll take a quick break and be back with more of your news after this.